first, if we can talk about Zionism, if you can set the stage for us and tell us what Zionism is and what it isn't.
Well, let me begin by saying that personally, I don't believe Zionism is a useful term to try to understand the nature of the conflict today and the dynamics of the conflict today. If I can use an analogy, I don't think any serious student of contemporary China would want to try to understand contemporary China by looking at Marxism, Leninism, or looking at Maoism. Now, as you know, even today, when China is the leading edge of international capitalism, it still officially calls itself Marxist-Leninist. But the fact that a government officially calls itself X or Y, in the case of Israel, Zionist, in the case of China, Marxist-Leninist, and also Mao Zedong thought, does not necessarily mean, it can mean, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these ideologies are particularly useful, or an analysis of these ideologies is particularly useful in trying to understand the society or its dynamics. However, it's also true that historically, yes, of course, Zionism played a role in the creation of the state of Israel. And I'm here to try to give some historical background. And in that regard, yes, Zionism is quite important. Now, I wouldn't say quite important, but it would be important. I wouldn't say very important, but it would be important in trying to understand the dynamics of the history of the conflict. So Zionism emerges at the end of the 19th century. Usually it's dated around 1880. Some people say 1881, 1882, when Europe is confronted with, or I should say, Jews are confronted with a situation in Europe, which is sometimes called the Jewish question. And the Jewish question, like there was a woman question, there was a class question. In the United States, there was a Negro question. It referred to the dynamics or the situation of a particular group of people, which didn't fit into some general or generic scheme. And the Jews formed a question. And the issue comes down to really two things. Jews suffered a particular form of persecution that was directed against Jews. So, first of all, where does this persecution come from? That was a big question. What are the roots of this persecution? And secondly, once you've analyzed the roots of the persecution, the source of the communication, of the persecution, the origins of the persecution, the next question is, then what's the solution? And different groups of Jews came up with different analyses of the source of the persecution, and then came up with different solutions to the problem. And some Jews came to the conclusion that the problem was capitalism, that capitalism was the root, the source, the origin of the persecution of the Jews and also of everybody else. For some people, it was capitalism eliminate capitalism and these special problems, the woman question, the Negro question, the Jewish question, they would all be eliminated if we can solve the class question. That was the thinking. Solve the class question, and you solve all the other questions. There is a thread in Marxism, which you can find from his earliest works, the works of Karl Marx, in which he says all human oppression, all human oppressions, the different kinds of oppression, they are all embodied in the oppression of the proletariat. That the kinds of human oppression across the board, they are condensed in the proletariat. So if you solve the oppression of the proletariat, the working class, then you've solved all human oppression. Many Jews, incidentally, were drawn to that idea. Not a majority, but quite a few. Now, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he once said, it is actually true to say Jews made the Russian Revolution. Nowadays, that's sometimes considered anti-Semitism because of very let's just say forget the very chauvinist Russians like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous writer. Solzhenitsyn, he did believe Jews made the Russian Revolution, but in his view, that was a terrible fact. And people accused Solzhenitsyn of being an anti-Semite for saying Jews made the Russian Revolution. That was his view. But for people on the left who were Jewish, that was a source of pride. If you, with the partial exception of Lenin, because there is some debate whether Lenin was 1/4 Jewish or not. I don't know. I find that I don't really accept it, but there's some debate. With the partial exception of Lenin and Stalin, all the leaders of the Russian Revolution were Jewish. Every single one. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, you just go down the line. They're all Jewish. So one group of Jews was attracted to the Marxist vision of if we eliminate capitalism and we create what's called a classless society, we will solve all the other human oppressions. Without going through all the other permutations and combinations, let's just get to the Zionists. The Zionist view basically was that Jews constituted a nation. They were not just a religious group, they were a nationality. And, continued the Zionists, in the normal state of things, every nation has its own state. So the Zionists reasoned that wherever Jews lived, they were aliens in those areas because the French state belonged to the French people, the German state belonged to the German people, the British state belonged to the British people. Every people had its own state. And it was because Jews were intrinsically alien to all the other states in the world. They didn't really care about the world, they cared about Europe. So even though I say world, they're really talking about Europe. Because Jews were alien to all the other states, there is, and here Sana's knowledge of science is useful, They said a body politic is like a human body. A human body repels aliens, alien presences. That's how our immune system works. It repels alien presences. So the Zionist view was Jews were an alien presence in Europe in as a whole, but in particular in each nation state, they were an alien. And therefore, the body politic, as against the human body, the body politic is repelling this alien presence. And that's what they said anti-Semitism was. And so, in their view, anti-Semitism was not an abnormality. It was not something that you should fight because, in their view, it was as natural and as normal as alien bodies in the human body are repelled by our immune system. And from that analysis of the Jewish question, they reached the conclusion the only way you can solve the Jewish question is not by fighting anti Semitism, but creating a state for the Jews. The other question is because I said once you pose a question in a certain way, the Jewish Marxists saw it as a class question. The Zionists saw it as a nation question. It was a problem of nationality. The second obvious question is where? Where is this state supposed to be? And in Europe at the time, there was an ideology. It's still very popular. None of these ideas are new. I'm just showing you how it was applied in the Zionist question. There was an idea that every state should be located in the place of origin of its people, what we would now call their historic homeland. So France was the historic homeland of the French people, and there was all these ideologies about roots. The Zionists thought then the natural place for their historic homeland should be Palestine, where the Jewish people originated. So that was, in a nutshell, the ideology. Now, as you can imagine, again, it doesn't take knowledge of particle physics. You can imagine the problem was, well, the French were already in France. The Germans were already in Germany. But the Jews were not in Palestine. So now a new problem arises. Okay, if you think the proper relationship between each nationality and its homeland is for them to go to where they originated, well, Palestine is already, there are people there on the one hand, and more importantly, the land belonged to other people. Either if you want to see it as belonging to the indigenous population, or if you want to see it as the current so-called owners of the land, in this case being the Ottoman Empire. And the question then is, how do you square the circle? How do you get the Jews into their homeland? And that's where, in my view, it ceases to be a question only of Zionism, and then it becomes a question of the ethos of the late 19th century. The late 19th century is called the era of the new imperialism, where the European countries are, its main manifestation is what's called the scramble for Africa, where the European countries are gobbling up Africa, but it also includes, obviously, the Middle East. And at this point, not because it was part of Zionist ideology, but because of practical, pragmatic considerations, the Zionists couldn't achieve their goal of a Jewish state in Palestine without participating in that new imperialism. In this case, eventually, though that was purely by chance, the Zionists tried to create a relationship with the Turks, with the Germans, with the French. They're looking around for an imperialist sponsor. Now, you have to remember, I'm not making any apologies, I'm just trying to speak factually. At that time, it wasn't looked at as something, nefarious, something evil. It was the era of the new imperialism, and so the Zionist movement was looking for an imperialist sponsor in order to create its state in Palestine. There was nothing unusual about that. Nobody saw, oh, the evil Zionists are trying to control Palestine. No, they looked around for an imperial sponsor. Imperialists are everywhere at this point, what were called back then. And incidentally, it wasn't a pejorative term, it wasn't a negative term to be an imperialist. And that began the entanglement between Zionism and imperialism. And that culminated, I don't think we have time now. I'm going to stop here because I want to give you a chance to talk. And that culminated in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British, or Her Majesty's, or His Majesty's government, looks with favor upon the founding of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Uh, and so the only point, there are many points here, and you can ask me questions on any of them. But for our purposes, for me, one of the important points is that I don't think Zionism had much to do in terms of its ideology with imperialism or capitalism. Zionism was just one version of a kind of ethnic nationalism all over Europe. This is what I called, as I said, the romantic nationalism. Each people should have its own state, and the state should be located in the place of origin of that people. That was a very popular idea back then. It's still, obviously, it has its resonance today. We call it the principle of self-determination of peoples. And from a practical point of view, in my opinion, well, we can argue about it. All of this talk about Palestinians are a people and therefore they're entitled to self-determination, and self-determination includes the right to a state. The fact is, these definitions don't really have much content. It really is all politics. The Palestinians did not win the right to self-determination and statehood because, according to some dictionary, they constituted a people, and as a people, they're entitled to the right of self-determination, and self-determination entitles them to the right to a state. It doesn't really work. They fought, they struggled, and they had a lot of backing. They had the backing of the Arab world for that particular demand. For that particular demand, they had the backing of a strong regional bloc. And because they had that political power behind them, they won the right to be recognized as a people, and therefore having the right of self-determination, and therefore a state. It was not intrinsic or to the nature of the Palestinian people. Because as I've tried to suggest, for all I know, people in Brooklyn are a people. I mean, how do you prove it's not?
You started out telling us that, is it Zionism that we actually are talking about, or is it something else because it has been modified through history and it's a different cause now? I understand that. Then firstly, what should we call it now to describe what's going on which kind of ideology are we talking about? And secondly, what is it not? Because we think it's very important for our organization to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Well, what is Zionism and what is it not? I would say Zionism has, in its origins, it had two essential components. Ideologically, it was a form of German Romanticism, this ideology of every nation or every people should have its own independent state. That was Zionism. Then I would say Zionism got intertwined historically, and basically it became inseparable from the phenomenon of late 19th century European imperialism, because Zionism could not realize its objective. It didn't have armies, it didn't have money. No rich Jew, there were a few rich Jews as a charitable thing, supported the Zionist undertaking in Palestine. But as a general rule, most Jews were not interested in Palestine. They were concerned with the countries, they had money, the countries in which they lived. And so their money, to the extent that they had, and there were Jews who were rich even, pre World War II, their attention was fixed on their own countries. So it was a poor movement, and it was had no power, and you couldn't conquer a place like Palestine, which was coveted by all the imperial powers for different reasons. Palestine was coveted by all the imperial powers. The British wanted Palestine because it was the northern flank of the Suez Canal, to protect the Suez Canal. The British also wanted Palestine because it was called one step along the land bridge to India. So Palestine played a role there. The French wanted Palestine, the Germans wanted Palestine for different reasons. So it was a coveted place, a desired place. There was no way the Zionists could win it unless they had imperial backing. It couldn't happen. So it became intertwined with imperialism, and it never separated. I mean, that became a constant of Zionism when it became a state, when it became a state after the Zionist project was realized, because the Zionist movement, it never believed the Arab world would accept them. It kind of internalized the idea that it was alien to the Arab world. And I think that's still a factor. Their main trading partner is the EU, and they see themselves as part of the West. Now, that doesn't mean a large part of the population came from the East, what's called the Sephardic Jews. But they see themselves as alien to the Arab world, and they see it as they'll never be accepted by the Arab world. And so it was a unifying theme in Zionist ideology after statehood by people like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. The Arab world will never accept us. We need a solid Western supporter, preferably the whole West, but it's not going to happen. So originally, during the creation of the State of Israel, it was the British. Then it became, after the State of Israel, became the French. And then after the 1967 war, of course, it became the Americans. So this entwinement with imperialism, it started from, as I say, in my opinion, with the Balfour Declaration and that problem of how do you create a state in an area which is not Jewish. So it begins as a kind of German Romanticism, then it becomes entwined with imperialism. However, we can argue over these things, disagree over them, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think the state of Israel today has anything whatever to do with Zionism anymore. What it is it's a racist, Jewish supremacist state, which uh, which desires power and influence, and all the so-called theory of Zionism is completely alien to these people. They're basically like many heads of state. They're just basically hoodlums and thugs who are trying to aggrandize, increase the power of their state. And they're also Jewish supremacists and racists who see the Arabs as an alien presence. In that respect, they're Zionists, of course. But on the other hand, there are many states that carry on that way, which are not, you wouldn't call them Zionist, They're the alt-right who don't like foreigners, who don't like immigrants, who don't like Arabs, who don't like Muslims. Would you say Modi in India is a Zionist because he hates Muslims? Would you say the Hungarian regime is Zionist, even though it loves Israel, but it hates immigrants? Then the realities of holding power and and preserving your state, they take precedence over the ideology. The ideology becomes a kind of facade for other things. And so Zionism is just a facade in the case of Israel.
Well, first of all, I think I don't want to dwell in this Zionist question too much longer because we have some other topics to discuss. But the reason why we would like to dwell in it is because we see it as grassroots organizations. We have to deal with people in a simple manner, and we have to have some words to describe, some simple words to describe this conflict and this analogy, and we have to call it something. Now, you say that Zionist, it's not appropriate. It's not an appropriate word to describe what's going on. I agree. After I heard your very detailed, into the depth explanation of why, but the reason why we still continue using this word is because I know in the Balfour Declaration it says that the Jews must have a state by any means necessary. And
No,
it doesn't say that?
No, it doesn't even come close to saying that.
Okay.
First of all, the Balfour Declaration, it was the result of a huge amount of lobbying, arguing, disputing among different branches of the British government, and within each branch, members of each branch of the British government. They never used the word state in the Balfour Declaration. They used the word homeland.
Homeland.
And it says, we look with favor upon the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, that was a very key preposition, in. It meant not the whole of Palestine, in Palestine. Now, the human rights organizations, sometimes they can be very good, sometimes they can be very bad. But one thing there's in common. One thing there's a common denominator. On its best days or its worst days, you can enter the word Zionism in Human Rights Watch's main website, the search function, enter Zionism. It will never come up. They don't use that language. Now, you might say it's cowardly that they don't use that language. Cowardly is probably part of it. I'm not going to doubt that. But the main fact is two things. Number one, you can say the same things that you want to say without saying the word Zionism. If you want to say Israel is a racist state, so just say Israel is a racist state. Why bring in Zionism? Why start with Zionism as racism? You could just use the language You can make your point. You can make your point without using that language. And number two, among normal people, which is a very broad spectrum, it's not used anymore. So what's the point of denouncing a phenomenon which means nothing to anybody? Now, I see all of these enraged Palestinian leftists, we want to denounce Zionism, Zionism about everything, Zionism is behind this, behind that. You're not talking to anybody. There's been a problem always with left politics, but also Palestine left politics in particular. That's the one I know, which is you choose the point that's hardest to win and to show how pure you are by focusing on what's hardest to win. That never made much sense to me. Do you want to show the world how pure you are? Or do you want to have a practical victory, which will first be significant? I said not trivial, significant. First, it will be significant. And secondly, from the point of view of morale, it lifts people's spirits. It tells them we can achieve something. We can achieve something. And that gives them incentive to try another thing. But if you keep focusing on the point of hardest resistance and you don't achieve anything, what do people conclude? That it's all a waste of time. Politics is a waste of time. We can't do anything, forget it. And you have to look at slogans. You have to choose slogans which don't show how pure you are, but have a chance of winning. Because what happened? All those protests with George Floyd, they disappeared. They disappeared overnight. And you know why? Because people didn't know what we're going out marching for. It became taking down statues of Abraham Lincoln. Now, for God's sake, half these young people are unemployed. Half of them, 3/4 of them, are going to be evicted come November when the election is over. 51% of young people in the United States, they're still living with their parents at age 30. It's the largest percentage since our Great Depression in 1930. Sana, you'll be surprised. 25% of American young people between 18 and 24, 25% have contemplated suicide. 1/4 have contemplated suicide. So you think they're going to go out every day to kick statues of Abraham Lincoln? Is that what they're going to do? To kick statues of Abraham Lincoln? You need a slogan that can win. So now all the people who march in those demonstrations, they think, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. And you know what they do? They start thinking about suicide again. And that's no exaggeration. I know the young people. I jog along Coney Island, the beach in New York, every day. It's now sprawled with homeless young people who sleep on the beach, homeless young people. Hopeless. And it's the same thing with the Palestine. So now I'll get back to it. Why do you make your litmus test? Okay, son, I use a scientific term. Litmus test. Why do you use the litmus test of the Palestinian right of return? It's the toughest right to win. I'm not saying you should drop it. You have that right. It's the law. You stick by that right. It's the law. You don't have to give it up. Well, why do you make it the litmus test? The toughest one to win. The one that will probably require the most compromises if you're going to get any of it, extract anything from it. Why do you do that? Because it has nothing to do with politics. It's about posturing, posing for the camera, sitting in your stupid internet terminal with your Facebook and your Instagram and all that other Twitter and all that other crap, and showing how radical you are, has nothing whatsoever with trying to actually improve the lives of a suffering people. Nothing whatsoever. No one says drop the right. The question is, do you want to win something that not only has real consequences for real people, but also energizes people? They feel like we can win something, and then they want to try to win more, and they want to try to win more. That's what politics is. It's about giving people real hope that mass action can change things.
I can't express how much I appreciate you coming on this session and wanting to share all of this with us. I hope that this will that our audience will like this as much as I've enjoyed it. We will release this in a couple of weeks, and alongside this, we will also release a number of other videos that have been pre-recorded and documents, so they get some history on it as well. We will keep you in the loop, and hopefully you can also join for Q&A with our audience on Monday in 3 weeks.